You know that flavor. The one you cannot quite name. The one that makes you keep eating long after you are full, that makes certain foods taste more like themselves than they have any right to. That savory, rich, almost electric quality that separates a good dish from a remarkable one. That flavor has a name. It has a history. And it has one of the most unfair reputations in the entire story of food. You are sitting at your favorite Chinese restaurant. The orange chicken arrives, glistening and perfect. You take a bite and something happens that is difficult to articulate. A depth of flavor, a richness, a savory satisfaction that goes beyond salt or sweetness or any of the tastes you learned about in school. Then someone at the table says it. I bet this place uses MSG. Is that not bad for you? Here is what that person almost certainly does not know. The Doritos they ate on the drive over contain honey. The ranch dressing they put on their salad at lunch contains it. The fried chicken from the drive-thru they stopped at last week contained it. The canned soup sitting in their kitchen pantry almost certainly contains it. The ingredient that got Chinese restaurants pressured into putting up no MSG signs in their windows. The same ingredient that became shorthand for cheap, suspicious, unhealthy food has been quietly present in the most mainstream American packaged foods for decades, listed under different names, consumed by the same people who considered it dangerous, without producing a single reported symptom. The story of how this happened is not really a story about food chemistry. It is a story about cultural bias, the power of anecdote over evidence, and how a single paragraph published in a medical journal in 1968 managed to reshape the way an entire nation thought about a cuisine. MSG stands for monosodium glutamate. It is a white crystalline powder that resembles table salt in appearance and does one specific thing with extraordinary efficiency. It amplifies the savory, meaty, deeply satisfying flavor that Japanese food science identified and named umami, the fifth fundamental taste, alongside sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Umami is not a modern invention or a chemical trick. It is the flavor of aged Parmesan cheese, of ripe tomatoes warmed in sunlight, of dried mushrooms, of a long-simmered meat broth. It is the quality that makes these foods taste more intensely like themselves, that creates the sensation of richness and depth that makes certain meals genuinely satisfying rather than merely filling. MSG delivers pure umami in concentrated, stable, crystalline form. The origin of MSG is a story of scientific curiosity meeting culinary tradition. In 1908, a Japanese chemist named Kikunae Ikeda was eating a bowl of dashi, a traditional Japanese broth made from kombu seaweed, when he noticed that the broth possessed a flavor quality he could not attribute to any of the four tastes then recognized by food science. It was not sweet, not sour, not salty, not bitter. It was something else, a savory depth that he became determined to identify and isolate. Ikeda took kombu back to his laboratory and spent months working to identify the compound responsible for this flavor. He eventually isolated glutamic acid, an amino acid present in the kombu, as the source. When he combined the glutamic acid with sodium to produce a stable, water-soluble salt, the result was monosodium glutamate. He tasted it. The flavor was exactly what he had detected in the broth, concentrated, pure, unmistakable. In 1909, Ikeda partnered with a businessman named Saburosuke Suzuki to found the Ajinomoto Company, a name that translates directly as essence of taste. They began producing MSG commercially from kombu seaweed, and it became immediately and enormously popular throughout Japan. Through the following decades, it spread across East Asia, becoming a standard kitchen seasoning in China, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines, as familiar and unremarkable to Asian cooks as salt or pepper. The original production method, extracting glutamic acid from seaweed through boiling and crystallization, could not scale to meet the global demand that developed through the 20th century. In the 1960s, Japanese food scientists developed a production method that remains the standard approach today, and it is one that most people find surprising when they first encounter it. Modern MSG is made through fermentation. The process begins with sugar, typically derived from sugar beets, sugar cane, or corn, dissolved in water to create a nutrient-rich liquid medium. Specific strains of bacteria, primarily Corynebacterium glutamicum, are introduced to this sugar solution. These bacteria metabolize the sugar and produce glutamic acid as a natural byproduct of their metabolism, in the same fundamental way that yeast metabolizes sugar and produces alcohol during brewing, or that bacteria metabolize lactose and produce lactic acid during yogurt fermentation. The fermentation proceeds over approximately 24 to 48 hours in large stainless steel tanks maintained at temperatures between 30 and 35 degrees Celsius. As the bacteria multiply and consume the sugar, glutamic acid accumulates in the liquid medium. When fermentation is complete, the bacteria are filtered out. Sodium hydroxide is added to the remaining glutamic acid-rich liquid, causing the sodium to bond with the glutamic acid and form monosodium glutamate in solution. This solution is then evaporated and concentrated until MSG crystals form, which are harvested, dried, and milled into the familiar fine white powder. The entire process takes approximately 3 days and produces a final product that is approximately 99% pure monosodium glutamate. Here is the chemical reality that makes the entire MSG controversy scientifically peculiar. The glutamate in MSG produced through this fermentation process is chemically identical to the glutamate that occurs naturally in tomatoes, in Parmesan cheese, in mushrooms, in soy sauce, and in dozens of other foods that have been eaten by humans across every culture for thousands of years. The human digestive system processes both in exactly the same way, because at the molecular level they are not different things. They are the same molecule. Given that MSG is a fermentation product chemically identical to a compound found naturally in widely eaten foods, and given that it had been consumed safely by hundreds of millions of people across Asia for 60 years before any health concern was raised, the question of how it acquired its toxic reputation requires a specific explanation. That explanation begins on a specific date, 1968. A physician named Robert Ho Man Kwok wrote a short letter, not a research paper, not a clinical study, not a systematic investigation, a personal letter of approximately 300 words to the New England Journal of Medicine. In this letter, Kwok described experiencing symptoms including numbness, weakness, and heart palpitations after eating at Chinese restaurants in the United States, and speculated that MSG might be the cause. He acknowledged explicitly that he was speculating. He presented no data, no controlled observations, no experimental evidence of any kind. The New England Journal of Medicine published the letter. The American media, always alert to a consumer health story with a simple villain and an exotic cultural angle, ran with it immediately and enthusiastically. Chinese restaurant syndrome became a widely reported phenomenon within weeks. Newspaper columns warned readers about MSG dangers. Television news segments covered the story as established fact rather than speculation. The cultural framing was not subtle. A foreign ingredient, used in foreign food, making Americans sick. Chinese restaurant owners, facing a collapse in customer confidence, responded with the only tool available to them. They put no MSG signs in their windows and removed it from their kitchens, whether or not they had ever used it in quantities that could plausibly cause the described symptoms. Meanwhile, scientists began actually testing the hypothesis. Study after study was conducted over the following decades. The Food and Drug Administration commissioned comprehensive reviews. International health regulatory bodies investigated. The consistent finding, across a large and methodologically rigorous body of research, was that MSG in the amounts typically present in food does not cause the symptoms attributed to Chinese restaurant syndrome in controlled conditions. The critical detail in those studies was the double-blind methodology. When participants who self-reported MSG sensitivity were given food containing MSG or identical food containing no MSG without being told which they had received, the reported symptoms did not correlate with actual MSG consumption. People reported symptoms after eating the placebo as often as after eating MSG-containing food. The effect was real. These were not people fabricating their discomfort, but it was not caused by MSG. It was caused by the expectation of symptoms, triggered by the knowledge or belief that MSG was present. The Food and Drug Administration classifies MSG as generally recognized as safe, the same regulatory category as table salt and sugar. While Chinese restaurants were removing MSG from their kitchens and advertising its absence to reassure customers, Something was happening simultaneously in the American packaged food industry that received essentially no public attention. Food manufacturers were adding glutamate, the same compound, the same chemistry, the same biological effect, to a vast range of mainstream American products. The difference was the labeling. Rather than listing monosodium glutamate, manufacturers used ingredient names that did not trigger the cultural alarm the MSG label had acquired: hydrolyzed vegetable protein, autolyzed yeast extract, natural flavors, textured vegetable protein. All of these contain free glutamate. All of them deliver the umami amplifying effect through the same mechanism as MSG. None of them generated health warnings or consumer advocacy campaigns. Doritos contain glutamate compounds. Campbell's soups contain them. Kentucky Fried Chicken's seasoning contains them. Hidden Valley Ranch dressing contains them. Pringles contain them. These products were sold throughout the period when Chinese restaurant syndrome was a mainstream media concern, consumed by many of the same people who were avoiding Chinese restaurants due to MSG anxiety, without producing a single organized consumer concern. The double standard was never primarily about chemistry. It was about cultural framing. MSG in Chinese food was foreign, unfamiliar, and associated with a cuisine that was already positioned as exotic and somewhat suspicious in mid-20th century American food culture. Glutamate compounds in American snack food were invisible, unnoticed, and unquestioned. MSG is fermented sugar. The bacteria that make it work the way yeast works in bread and beer, and the way bacteria work in yogurt. The glutamate it delivers is chemically identical to the glutamate in the tomatoes, the aged cheese, and the cured meats that have been central to human cuisine across every culture for thousands of years. The concern that surrounded it for over 50 years began with a speculative letter, not a study. It was amplified by cultural bias, not evidence. And it was applied selectively to one cuisine and one cultural context, while the same compound was simultaneously added to mainstream American products under names specifically chosen to avoid triggering the same response. The science, conducted over 5 decades and across multiple continents, reached a consistent conclusion. In normal food amounts, MSG is safe. The human body processes its glutamate the way it processes glutamate from every other source, because the molecule does not know or care how it was produced or what it was called on the label. The next time someone at your table raises a concern about MSG, you now have the full story. A Japanese chemist isolating a flavor compound from seaweed in 1908. A fermentation process that has been producing the same molecule safely for 60 years. A 300-word letter that changed public perception without changing the chemistry. And the orange chicken, which was always just orange chicken, made delicious by the same umami that makes everything delicious, carrying a reputation it never deserved, and tasting exactly as good as it always has.